is an email from Ted, and here's what he writes. I'm not just a fair weather camper and fisherman. I love the outdoors and exploring it. And this is a true story. I'm now 58 years old. And on this evening, I was in my mid-40s. My wife and I used to camp a lot in a big 1-ton truck and a camper rig that we owned. And on this evening, myself and my friend Tom had just made camp on the edge of a secluded lake midway up Vancouver Island on the coast of British Columbia. We left our wives at an event in the town of Nanaimo, and we were going to continue on up the island. Okay, there's nothing funny about that sentence. However, I think it's funny that Nanaimo is spelled N-A-N-A-I-M-O, and the writer phonetically wrote it out for me, and I don't know if he did that for me or if he probably does that for a lot of people. But I've had a lot of people say, hey, I can do some editing for you, and I can even phonetically spell out the words that you probably can't pronounce. Y'all, I'm not embarrassed that I can't pronounce some words, and there are some words that I know how to pronounce, but I cannot get my mouth to form the words. I don't know what it is. Anyway, I'm digressing quite a bit here. I just thought that was funny that he phonetically spelled it out. All right, back to the story. The plan was to rough it fishing in a rugged spot that I knew of, just us guys. After leaving the main highway, we had traveled for the better part of the afternoon down a gravel logging road to reach this spot. It was late spring and there was still a chill in the air. The trip in was long, but I was excited to experience these secluded lakeside campsites again. I expected some monster trout to be waiting. I had been there once before to visit a large cave that was at the very end of the road into this area. We made our way around to the backside of the lake, and we had our pick of campsites. Well, if you could call them that. This mountainside came straight down to the lake without a natural beach. Whoever had created the campsites had cut away material for a road and then left it natural around the lake. The campsites themselves were nothing special. They were just reasonably flat spots cut into the wild lakeside. Once we parked, looking back at the mountain seemed to reach right down to the very edge of the lake. And it was an odd place, and I remember not being so happy with it. The truck was parked and the jacks were down, and I got on with building a campfire. We pulled out our chairs and began to talk and relax. Now, Tom is a notorious loud talker. He had no sense of how a private conversation worked. So what was once silent wilderness was now wide awake. The two of us were probably now audible all across the lake. With that said, we heard no other voices. We were there on our own, and there was still a bit of daylight, and we were enjoying recounting the events of previous fishing trips. I was starting to talk about dinner when Tom's face took on a startled look. Hey, you just about got hit by that rock, he said. Well, I was oblivious. I'd just been nattering away, but he'd seen a large rock fly by and land not far away from me. A few minutes later, another rock bounced past us, and I saw this one. It was a softball-sized rock, and I couldn't help but be concerned. I recognized the danger of being hit, and I figured they were rolling down the mountainside because of snow melting. It was certainly steep enough that a rock could bounce down from some kind of natural erosion like that, but the idea that they were being thrown, that never occurred to me. This continued a few more times until a big one landed in the lake, and with this we stood up and began looking up the mountainside. We couldn't see anything moving. There were no deer or animals visible, and there didn't seem to be an area that looked loose. Once we began surveying the situation, the rocks stopped, and it was hard to take in such a large area, and now the light was getting low. We lost interest in the rocks. I went on with cooking dinner. We ate and settled down to a few beers and probably some more lively conversation. And then something happened that I'll never forget. The silence of the lakeside ended like an alarm bell ringing, and what seemed to be a woman began screaming at the top of her lungs. It was loud and clear and coming from somewhere right above us on this dark mountainside. We were both instantly at full alert. The screaming then continued just as loud, echoing out across the lake. This time it scared me to the bone, sending shivers up and down my back. The screams sounded human. It did not occur to me it was anything else but a woman screaming at the top of her lungs. Well, who was up there? There are no roads on that mountain. What was someone doing up there? This was so out of place on such a quiet night and with no other signs of people around the area. The area was not populated. This was logging company land with 20 miles of boggy, mosquito-infested forest punctuated with small, shallow lakes. We were backing into coastal mountains. And beyond that was wild rainforest for many miles leading to the wild north coast of the island. Was someone in serious trouble or being attacked? I had no doubt in that moment that that was the case. My senses were piqued and I expected to hear someone crying for help any second. A minute passed. There was nothing. No sound. Neither Tom or I spoke. It was completely silent. Darkness came quick and horror enveloped our campsite. The fear that someone was in serious trouble hung over us, but there were no more signs of this person. We looked around as best as we could with our flashlights, and we called out into the dark, and there were no further signs of trouble or strangeness. I had a lousy night of sleep. I felt someone had been in trouble, but I also knew how odd it was. How could someone be up on that mountainside with no roads? She sounded really close. Why would she stop yelling? What would make a person scream like that and just stop? There was intense emotion in this scream, and whoever did it was communicating with us on purpose. At that time, I didn't see how the rocks and the screams could be connected, but in hindsight, and with what I've learned, I suspect it may have been Sasquatch objecting to our rude and noisy entrance to the lake. Were we being told that we were not alone? Was this creature imitating the sounds that other humans had made when it had encountered us? The next morning, several other camping rigs rumbled into the area. The sounds of a few families and boaters filled the air. We got on with our fishing and we forgot about our strange welcome, and we never spoke of it again. Tom was killed in a car accident a few years ago. Now I've camped throughout the Rockies and the national parks, some with bears close, and cougars are common animals here on the island. I've never encountered such a mystery in the wild country before or since. And that's the end of his email. Oh man, what a great story. Vancouver Island is a total wilderness from what I understand. I've never been out there, but I've seen TV shows on it and videos about Vancouver Island, and I think it's full of bears, brown bears, the real big mean ones like the grizzly, Kodiak kind of bears. I don't know. And fishing, I think I'd have to rethink fishing on an island covered up with bears, but I might be wrong. There may not be any bears on Vancouver Island. You guys comment below and let me know, people who know. I'd love to hear about it. But thanks, Ted, for this email. It was really good. What a great story. He hasn't seen anything before or since like this, and it really makes you wonder what's going on Vancouver Island. Thank you again for the email. My name is Lynn, and I live in Coleman, Alabama. In 1989, my grandparents bought a 67-acre farm. I was 4 when they moved in. According to my mother, and these are her stories, we moved out to the middle of nowhere because the house we were moving from was haunted. She has even said that our family was cursed, but that the curse ended with the death of my granny from cancer when I was 7. It was a 2-story house with a basement that sat about 100 yards from the railroad tracks. Rumor has it that the woman who owned it before we moved in used a Ouija board. Also, the front and back doors lined up, making it possible to see straight through the house. Some say that's a bad omen. My mother said the things that I'm about to tell you never happened when Pawpaw was home, but he drove an 18-wheeler, so he wasn't home much. Mom called them demons. She said things would always happen at night and any time they went into the basement. There were always weird noises and doors would shut or slam on their own. Stuff would just fall from the tables and shelves. Mom's bedroom was upstairs, along with my aunt and uncle's rooms. Mom and my aunt always slept in the same bed, though, despite having their own rooms. One night while they slept, she felt the covers being pulled from her. She thought it was my aunt being a cover hog, so she yelled at her to stop. And as soon as she did, something jerked the covers completely under the bed. In her bedroom, she said she could hear something scratching or clawing in the attic. If she closed the closet door before going to bed, it would open itself sometime in the night. If she left it open, it would close itself. Mom, Granny, and my aunt would all be in one room and they'd hear a gunshot come from somewhere else in the house. No one else would be home. Mom thought this all stemmed from an event that happened when they were children. My uncle, the oldest of the three, was 8 years old and playing at my granny's sister's house with his cousins. My mom and aunt were there too, but at that moment it was just my uncle in the room with one first cousin. There was a shotgun on the wall, unloaded and with no ammo. It went off and killed my cousin. My uncle's fingerprints were not on the gun. This was part of the curse my mother spoke of. They would also often hear rocks and other objects being thrown at the house, no matter the time of day. They'd hear it from the back and go to investigate. By the time they got back there, it was coming from the front of the house. Mom always said they never messed with me, so when she'd go to the basement to do laundry, she'd always make me come with her. Now, I was really young when we lived there, newborn to age 4. I don't remember much about living there, but I do remember 2 events. The first one happened when we came home from the store once and all the cabinet doors were open and everything in them was on the floor. The second they tried to convince me was a dream, but a dream doesn't stick you with detail by detail for 30+ years. I would usually sleep in the bed with my granny and Pawpaw when he was home, but I would often wake up in the middle of the night and go upstairs to play with my toys in my mom's room. One night, I crawled out of bed and turned into the kitchen. There was a sliding glass door there, and the blinds were pulled back even though they were always closed. There was a figure on the porch. It had a big human-looking head, but it had paint on it, kind of swirled. The colors were white, yellow, and black and blue. It wasn't painted like a clown. It started making faces at me and beckoning me to come to it. I turned to go back into my grandparents' room, but their blinds were twisted and I could see it in their window too. It was holding one finger over its mouth as if to say, "Hush." For someone to be able to look into the window in my grandparents' room, they'd have to be 7 feet tall or taller. Then it was in the door frame between the kitchen and my grandparents' room, which was also the living room. The next morning, they found me sleeping in the door frame, and I told them what happened. Not long after that, we moved. We moved out, my granny's sister and her husband moved in. He was a preacher, so he blessed the house. Even so, remembering going there to visit, and nobody was allowed upstairs or downstairs. They didn't live there long. As I mentioned earlier, my granny had cancer. She actually had it 2 different times. This goes along with the curse I mentioned earlier. First, Granny had breast cancer. They found it and did treatments and ultimately removed the cancerous breast. During surgery, she died. She was even pronounced dead by the doctor. Somehow, she was revived. I'm not sure how. I'm not clear on that part of the story. Mom said that Granny told her and my great aunt that while she was dead, the devil was running around the operating table laughing and yelling that she and her family will be his. Granny lived another 2 years before the second cancer got her. She was bedridden for a couple of months before she passed away. The week before she passed, I got off the school bus and opened the front door to find her running around the house yelling, "The Lord has healed me." On the day she passed, while she was still in her bed, and my mom and aunt and great aunt were cleaning her up before the funeral home came to take her away, my little brother and I and my younger cousin walked out of the bedroom to be greeted by a man in the hallway. He was wearing a white tuxedo and looked just like the man in the "I Can't Believe It's Not Butter" commercial. He looked down at us and smiled, and then he said, "Everything will be okay," and walked right through the wall into my granny's room. And those are the stories I remember of the haunted house we lived in when I was a boy. Okay, this is a little short story that I've had for a little while, and it's not real scary or anything, and it's not a Bigfoot story, but it's very heartwarming. The writer's name is Missy. She writes, "I heard you reading a ghost story. Now, I haven't seen a Bigfoot, but I have seen a ghost on more than one occasion. Most are just a fleeting moment of a stranger, but this one was special. My husband was in the Marine Corps, and we were stationed in Yuma, Arizona. We were living on the base, in base housing in Yuma. We're from the same little town in Alabama, not too far from Mississippi. At the time, I was 26 weeks pregnant and did not know it yet, but things were about to get scary. I woke up in the middle of the night to see my mama and 2 people that I didn't know. I think they were her parents. They died before I was born, so I only have seen old black and white pictures. They all looked concerned. I was startled, but excited to see her. She had passed away just under 2 years before. Then they disappeared in just a few seconds, and I got up and went down the hall, but they were gone. What I didn't know was at 27 weeks I would be hospitalized for pre-eclampsia, E-C-L-A-M-P-S-I-A, eclampsia. I'm not sure what that is. I would go home after a couple of days on bed rest. However, on my next checkup at 29 weeks, my blood pressure was out of the roof, so I was taken to the hospital. I was about to go full eclamptic and be air ambulanced to Phoenix. My son was delivered by cesarean section and was in NICU for 3 months until his due date. He was born 1 pound and 12 ounces, and if not for the grace of God and the good care at Good Sam and Phoenix Children's Hospital, we would have died. I think Mama was either there just worried or preparing to take us home. My son was lucky and he never had to go back into the hospital. A lot of preemies do have to revisit a bit, but he's now 5'10" and he's a radiology technologist. And she writes, that's a fancy name for the person that takes your x-ray in the hospital. We're blessed to still be here on this big blue ball and to have family no matter where they may be. Thanks for working so hard doing these stories. You can use my nickname, Missy. What a great story. 1 pound, 12 ounces. Just think about that. These babies, he was 29 weeks. I think it was 29. He was born by cesarean weighing 1 pound, 12 ounces. I don't know. There's a lot of argument going on about if these fetuses are people or humans or not. You know the whole debate. And this is one of the things that always really makes me wonder if a baby can be born at 1 pound, 12 ounces and grow up and be a 5'10" radiology technologist, which again is a fancy name for a person that takes your x-ray at the hospital. It's pretty compelling, Let's save those babies. All right, let's go to another one. This is an email from Tammy, and this is one of the strangest stories I've read in a while. It's really good. She writes, "Hello, my name is Tammy. First, I love listening to all the stories you tell from other people's encounters with cryptids and aliens. I like the stories about Bigfoot the best. I decided to write my true encounter of a different kind. I don't think I've ever heard you tell a story like this, but I could be wrong, so here it goes. I'm from Texas, and I live in a small town not far from Bryan and College Station, Texas. I drive a garbage truck, and I go to other towns to pick up carts. On one occasion, I was on my way back to park my truck at my job. It was around dusk where the sun had already gone down, and there was just enough light that I could still distinguish colors all around me without having to shine a light on it. As I was approaching a stretch of trees, large creatures began flying out of the treetops and gliding across the road. Now, it may sound strange, but they looked like gargoyles that I've seen in films. These were much larger than buzzards. I know what a buzzard looks like when I see one. They're quite common here. But I counted 8 of these creatures, and in the fading light, I could see clearly that their skin was a muted gray color, and they had no feathers. Once I couldn't see them, I began questioning the whole episode. I was in disbelief, or denial, if that makes sense. Had I really seen what I thought I saw? I ran all the animals that I know of through my mind, and nothing fit. They looked like gargoyles. That's all I can come up with. And I had not dreamed this up, and it was not my imagination. And here's how I know that. A few miles down this road, and I was beginning to shake off the strangeness of what I had seen. And up ahead there was another grove of trees. My eyes went straight to the treetops. I didn't expect to see the same vision, but to my great surprise, I saw their huge wings launch them from the treetops again. They flew to a point across the road where the trees obscured my view of them, and then they were gone. This time I counted 6 of the creatures, and now I had confirmed it. Something odd in the shape and movement of a gargoyle was flying around the woods close to College Station, Texas. And prior to this event, I had seen spirits. I've even seen a UFO, and my brother has seen a Bigfoot. But I and no one I know has ever seen anything like what I saw that evening. I would really like to know if by any chance has anyone in the audience seen anything like I've described. Thanks for reading my story. Well, Tammy, there it is. It's out there for the public to hear. And I would like to know if you guys have seen big flying creatures like this. That would absolutely freak me out. I don't know what I would do if I saw something like that, but it's kind of scary, but it's kind of mystical, and, it sparks your imagination a little bit. But I believe she saw something like this. Absolutely. Her email is very short and very genuine, and I really appreciate it. So you guys comment below if you've ever heard of or seen anything like this. Thanks, Tammy, for the email. The last part of this podcast is a chapter from an audiobook that was just released last week by the author Jack LaFountain. It's one of the Ed Landry novels. I was lucky enough to get to narrate the book. If you're interested in listening to this book after hearing this, I suggest that you start with the audiobook Bayou Moon, then go to Blood Moon, and then listen to Voodoo Moon. It's not necessary that you listen to them all in order. However, I think the story will make more sense if you know where Ed Landry came from, and that all begins in the audiobook Bayou Moon. So it's a trilogy. There's 3 of them. Jack LaFountain did a great job writing these, and I enjoy reading them and narrating them. They're just a lot of fun. They're mystery novels with rougarous and werewolves and voodoo and all kind of creepy stuff. This is a chapter from that book. If you would like a free download of this book, if you will send me an email to dixiecryptid@gmail.com, and in the subject line write Voodoo Moon. The first 25 people that send me an email like that, I'll send you a promotional code where you can download the book free from Audible. But you must have an Audible account. If you don't have an Audible account, don't send an email because it'll just be a promo code that's wasted. So I'd love you to buy the book. Jack and I both would. He's worked hard on these novels, and I really enjoy doing them. So send me an email if you're interested in a promo code. But right now, here's a chapter from VooDoo Moon. Hope you enjoy it. Chapter 9. Dr. Lindsay stuck his head in the door. Gary looked up from his silent vigil at Dee's bedside, relieved the doctor had derailed his train of thought. He had been busy cursing himself for being a fool and hanging around her room, like the same old sucker he'd been for God knows how long. "What's up, Doc? Did I really just say that?" "Sorry, Doc," he said. "It's okay," Lindsay said with a chuckle. "And believe it or not, that phrase is about lost. I was just looking in before I head home to try to get some sleep. Dr. Jackson is taking over. He's down in the doctor's lounge. I told him I was going to send you down there so you could lie down on the couch for a while. It's not much, but it beats that chair. The nurses will let you know if anything changes." "I don't know, Doc," Gary murmured. "I do. Go get some sleep. Doctor's orders. Go on and get some sleep now." "I guess so." Gary shook the man's hand. "Thanks again." Miles away, a phone rang. A tall man with icy blue eyes lifted the receiver. He listened for a moment and hung up without a word. He walked across the room and bent to whisper in an old woman's ear. A sour look crossed her face. She lit a candle and began to mumble in a steady rhythm. Far away, a voice cried out, "No! God, no!" Bones bent and broke, the shards forming a new face. Fingers sprouted long claws as hair grew to cover them. The figure fell to the floor, writhing and howling in pain, and it rose moments later with eyes of fire and a raging thirst for blood. The door swung open on its own, and the monster bolted out into the night. Christy Duloc listened to the rhythmic muttering in the next room as her eyelids drew down and she surrendered to the sleep she had been fighting. The ground under her bare feet was damp and the air heavy with a mist rolling off Bonaire Bayou. "I'm dreaming," she told herself. There were certainly worse places to be than along the bayou where she grew up. Since she was dreaming, she might as well go with it and enjoy the muffled song of gators and frogs. Where was she going? She couldn't remember, but she knew she was going somewhere. A figure dressed in white gradually emerged from the mist and walking her way. As the figure got closer, a familiar face took shape. "Dee, is that you?" A vacant-eyed Dee Will stared straight ahead, seemingly oblivious to the greeting. Christy reached out and took her friend by the arm, bringing her to a halt. She gasped as Dee's head haltingly turned to face her as if moved by an unseen, unsteady hand. Her soulless eyes seemed to stare into eternity, colorless, eyes that swam with the reflected fog. "Dee!" Christy shouted, shaking the entranced woman. "Dee, it's me, Christy. What are you doing here?" "Penance." Dee's lips moved. The dead voice was hers, but it seemed to come from far away. Dee twisted her arm free of Christy's grip and ambled mindlessly away. It was a dream, Christy reminded herself, and continued on her way, still not knowing whither she went. Whither? Where did that come from? The word's origin was no stranger than her mysterious destination, and Christy shrugged and kept walking. She hadn't gone far when the mournful strains of an electric guitar reached her ears and was soon joined by congas and a xylophone. The guitar soared in a tune she knew but couldn't quite recall. The song explained it all, if only she could recall the words. The rhythm drove her on to a clearing in the cypress trees. A fire was burning before a decrepit shack where a woman squatted stirring the contents of a pot that hung suspended from an iron frame over a crackling fire. and as she approached, the woman looked up at Christy and beckoned her to come closer. The old woman rose to greet her, grimacing with pain that accompanied the straightening of arthritic joints. As she drew closer, the old woman's features became clear. Her skin was the color of dried tobacco, and the furrows crossing her forehead and the deep lines framing her smile like rippling water gave her face a matching texture. Short hair, white with age, covered her head, and her eyes showed nothing of age. They shone with an inner fire and a hunger that reminded Christy of a famished man sitting down to a feast. The woman waved her closer still, and Christy felt herself being drawn into a bottomless fiery pit behind the old woman's eyes. Her blood became a pulsing, frozen current creeping through her veins. The old woman reached out an ancient hand, the nails crusted with rust. She laid the hand upon Christy's arm, turning her to stand shoulder to shoulder. The fingers left Christy and directed her eyes to the pot. A large ivory white object bobbed in the foul-smelling brew that bubbled within. From the corner of her eye, Christy saw the old woman's head nod in apparent satisfaction with her cooking. She wanted to ask what it was, but she could neither turn her head nor speak, adding a fresh level of fear that refused to be told that it was only a dream. The bone-like object rolled on the boiling brew, and there was no need for questions. A human skull seemed to smile up at her, and for a flickering moment the face of Ed Landry flashed in her mind. The scream she wanted would not come, and her head turned of its own volition, forcing Christy to stare into the old woman's eyes. The wrinkles of the woman's face deepened and widened around her growing smile, and her lips parted to reveal twin rows of sharp teeth. Hair the color of midnight sprouted from her cheeks. Her eyes were pools of molten gold, as with an excruciating slowness the lupine visage formed from the human one that once was. Still no scream would come to set Christy free, and her mouth was open wide, silent, mid-scream, when the monster's jaws closed on her throat, wreathing her head in a corona of red fog. A single word, more like a whisper than a shout, escaped her collapsing airway. "Ed!" Christy bolted upright in her bed and panting. Gasping sobs exploded from her while somewhere in her mind, or maybe just the next room, a woman's laughter rang. Landry decided against returning home to sleep and headed back to the police station. His back would scold him later for sleeping in a cell, but he wanted a pair of eyes open nearby when he closed his. He was pulling up to the curb outside the building when a cruiser with lights and sirens blazing cut him off. A feeling of dread swept over him and hit the gas in pursuit. It was a short trip. The cruiser turned into the hospital and stopped at the emergency room doors. He snatched the confiscated gun off the passenger seat and stuffed it in the waistband of his pants. He chased the deputy past a blood-covered nurse slumped against the wall and through a crowd gathered at the doorway at the end of the hall. They were greeted by an ashen-faced Gary Wills, his haunted eyes vacant. Landry glanced over Gary's shoulder at Dee's room. He spun the deputy around. "Get him out of here," Landry ordered. "Where, Sheriff?" "Away from here, goddammit! Move!" He wheeled on the crowd, eyes blazing. "Everyone get the hell out of here!" The crowd quickly found other places to be and new deputies to occupy them. "He's at the nurse's station," the returning deputy reported. "Please go back and sit with him," Landry said. "You don't have to say or do anything, but just sit with him. You got it?" "Will do, Sheriff," he said, and retraced his steps back to Gary's side. Landry turned and stepped into Dee's room and pulled the door closed behind him. He bowed his head a moment under the weight of realization that he might spend the rest of his life walking into this scene. Dee Wills lay on her back, open eyes staring into eternity, awash in a sea of red, with a large section of her throat gone and her body ripped open from sternum to pubis. The door latch disengaged with a click, and the door began to open. Landry turned to rain curses on whoever it was, but suddenly he stopped. "Jazz, thank God it's you." I think that'll wind it up for this podcast. I meant to get back on a regular schedule this week, but as usual, the creek rose and the Lord wasn't willing. I had to spend a whole week changing a big job that I submitted that I thought was my last job I was going to do for a while. Found out all the connections on it needed to be changed to meet some, just my luck. Anyway, it's a long story, but it took me about a week to change it all. It's been resubmitted. So now, hopefully, I'll get back on a regular schedule with this podcast, and I'm working furiously on Steve Lilly stories for that new podcast for Steve Lilly, which I will announce when it's ready to go, and it shouldn't be too long. So I hope you guys have a good week, and we'll see you on the next podcast. It shouldn't be more than a day or two, and I'll have another one up. Love you all, and we'll see you on the next one. Thanks.